parliamentarism. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for North Island, Powell River.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to speak on Bill 377. I, first of all, just want to acknowledge the member from Bruce Grey, Owen Sound. Him and I have worked on a few things together, and I have a deep amount of respect for him and the work that he does in this place, so I'm very pleased to be able to speak on this piece of legislation. Now, I think it is a very interesting one, and I think of it in particular in the context of the work that I have done on PROC, a committee that was overseeing a study on foreign interference. And as we were going through that process, what we heard again and again was that the members of the committee were not vetted and didn't have clearance to access information that would really make the process for us a lot more logical, a lot less partisan, and more focused on the important issues that we're dealing with. So this bill really would allow for parliamentarians to be vetted, to go through a process, and I think it's really important to underline the fact that this isn't giving them clearance unless they go through that process. But it means that parliamentarians would be able to apply, they would be able to go get all of the interviews and have things checked out to make sure that they can be trusted to have secret information that the government may not necessarily want you to see, or that we may simply just not have the appropriate clearance, which blocks that pathway for parliamentarians. So whether or not a parliamentarian actually gets that clearance is based on their history and on their capacity to get that. So this bill really addresses that, allows for parliamentarians to get that done. And I think where this is really important, and Canadians need to think about this, is, we see a lot of drama sometimes in this place, and it's largely based on hearsay. And I know as a parliamentarian, one of the challenges that I've had in the work that was put before me, especially around the foreign interference file, was that you were trying to understand what was happening without all of the information. And I understand some of that information couldn't necessarily be shared. I think it is really important that Canadians understand that our relationship with other countries really matters. And when we get information shared with us because of our partnerships with other countries, we have to have a very clear process, and that needs to be protected, because if it isn't, it will lessen the trust that other countries have for us and their ability to share information with us. So we need to assess all of those things. But even if we're able to look at a committee, have all the members of the committee be vetted, if somebody from a particular party cannot get that vetting, to have somebody sit in there in their place who is vetted, it means that that committee can actually do some of that work. And there's a transparency, at least to members of Parliament. And when we talk about foreign interference, we know that's part of the challenge that we've been facing, is that people who have been specifically targeted don't have the clearance, and they don't have a clear process in this place, which is horrible, that doesn't allow people to know that they're being targeted. And I know as an MP, as I've gone through that process, I've been very concerned about who is being targeted, how will we know if we're being targeted, and what that looks like. But the other part of this, and why I will be supporting this bill, is that we know that Parliament is already a slow place. Government is a slow place. We know that things move far too slowly, and it really builds a sense of frustration sometimes for Canadians. So if we have a process where MPs and senators are put in their position or elected to their position, who can go out, do the appropriate tasks, do the thorough assessment, and then have that secret clearance, then they will be able to know information, and then they will be able to clearly explain process, not the details. I think we have to be very aware of that. Parliamentarians would know things, but they wouldn't be able to tell, but they would be able to say, I saw it, I know what's happening, and here's information that might allay your fears or might grow your fears. And in this day and age where we are seeing such a vast changing reality, and I think of just last weekend when I was at the NATO Parliamentary Association, We talked about the development of AI and what that means for military action, what that means in terms of having information set out to all people in the world, our constituents, of course, included in that, how we need to sort of assess those things and understand, well, the world is becoming trickier. It's trickier for parliamentarians in our particular role, and it's trickier for Canadians. And I think when we look at this, we have to look at what is disinformation, what in terms of trust is being broken or poisoned by disinformation for everyday Canadians. It is a lot to try to understand all of the different things that are happening, and it's hard sometimes to know what information is thorough, which is researched, and what is actually from bad actors selling disinformation specifically because they want to attack our democracy. And so this is another tool. It's not the only tool. I mean, we could talk a long time about the other tools that we need, but this is a tool that would allow parliamentarians to come together. So right now we do have NSACOP, which is one committee where all the people in it are cleared. They have access to information, and that is a good process. I have no problem with it. But we need to have that expanded to this degree, and I think this bill really does a good job of talking about how we could do that. It's not going to fix all of the problems, but it's certainly going to address some of them. Madam Speaker, I think, for me, one of the things that I learned really clearly in the work that I was doing around foreign interference is that there's particular communities that are vulnerable to misinformation. And I was particularly passionate because what I understood as I went through that process is that rural and remote communities are one of those areas that are more vulnerable to disinformation. And the reason that they are more vulnerable is often their local media has been shut down. They don't have enough money to keep going. So that means when information comes out that they may need to know, local radio stations, local newspapers may or may not be there to actually report that. And so it does mean that there are particular challenges. And I think also we heard very clearly that, some ethnic media was also having particular challenges. So, I will say that when we look at this as a whole of building trust, we want to build trust with Canadians, building trust with our institutions of government. When we look at having parliamentarians be more aware and more accountable and have tools to do that work, these things all have to come together. So this is one part. I appreciate that that's one part, and we need to definitely see more. And I also just want to say that as we move through this new world that we're really facing, we have to look at how to educate people, everyday Canadians, more about security measures and what they look like and why we have to follow them so that people understand where we should push and where we should not push. I think that's really important because those relationships internationally and that information can be making us extremely vulnerable. And I also think that we need to look at education. I know some countries are doing a phenomenal job and starting to invest more resources into educating kids from a very young age about how disinformation is spread, what capacity you have with a green screen to make things that are not real look real. And I think about, some places are actually having colleges and universities have courses in those, any kind of training, all the way from becoming a scientist to a carpenter to somebody who's learning about welding to somebody who wants to take business. They actually have components where they educate people about what's happening in the world, how to decipher misinformation, and how to develop that critical thinking process that's so important. So I look forward to supporting this bill. I look forward to it going to committee to make sure that all the things we want it to do, it does do. But I also hope to see more work in this place around educating everyday Canadians as we go into a technology world that is really changing so rapidly. Thank you, Madam Speaker.